So today we're joined by David Black, who served as a professor of anthropology at the University of New Brunswick for a quarter century, building the archaeology program there essentially from scratch. His graduate work, culminating in master's and PhD degrees from McMaster University, launched his research agenda in the human ecology of coastal and insular New Brunswick, with a major program of field research in the Quoddy region. David's published extensively, including the book Living Close to the Ledge, Prehistoric Human Ecology of the Bliss Islands, Insular Quoddy Region, New Brunswick, Canada. And in 2023, he was awarded the Canadian Archaeological Association's Smith-Wittenberg Award. We're also joined by Josh Cummings, who's an archaeologist in Fredericton at WSP. He completed his undergraduate and master's degrees at UNB, where his thesis was on the archaeology of Falls Island in coastal Maine, on a project that merged collection analysis with survey. His publications have appeared in Paleoamerica and Northeast Anthropology, and he's presented his work at the Maine Archaeological Society meeting and the Eastern States Archaeological Federation. Although active in CRM, he's maintaining a breakneck pace of research, focused especially on the analysis of legacy collections. Welcome to the show, Josh and Dave.
Yes, welcome to the show.
Thanks for the invitation.
In Studio 199?
We're in Studio 199, that's right.
199.
And we were enjoying colonial flips.
Yeah.
As was foreshadowed, I think, in season 2.
I believe so.
Yeah. And how is everyone enjoying their flip?
Excellent.
Okay.
I wouldn't say excellent, but I'm getting it down.
Yeah. It tastes a little bit like beer, like warm beer mixed with cheap rum.
Yeah.
Which means it smells a little bit like...
But there's more protein.
Yes, it's got a little bit of an omelet in it.
Yeah.
What do the eggs do for us?
They make
flannel road, I believe. That's the texture that was described in the recipe.
Yard of flannel.
Yard of flannel.
In the notes.
The
chunky texture that we saw.
Yeah. Well, that's what we strained out.
Yes.
Yeah. Exactly. But that's not why we're here.
Of course, that's partly why we're here. But we're going to talk mostly about a recent update to the Archaic period that Josh and Dave have been doing, which is kind of an update to the Gathering Pebbles at a Boundless Shore online report that you guys have just finished. But maybe
so if we start during the Paleo period, we all were co-authors on a paper last year where we were talking about how little we know about the late Paleo period. So this period kind of leading up to about 10,000 years ago. I think broadly speaking, when we're talking about the Archaic, we're beginning around 10,000, 9,500 years ago. And we've had some major environmental change in the region. So we've got...
And that's why there were no people here. That's what Richie Fitting said, right?
Well, so the classic model was this idea of a great hiatus, and that so people essentially, the old outmoded way of thinking about the early Archaic was that people left the region after the Paleo period, right? And in some arguments that they left after the fluted point period, right?
Yeah.
And so we're into the Archaic, and broadly speaking, there's a bunch of stuff that's happening. So you got environmental change, we've got technological change, right? So we've got the introduction of heavy groundstone tools. So there's a couple of technological traditions, Josh, that are coming in with this early Archaic stuff. Like what's happening in terms of groundstone tools.
Yeah. So I actually saw this last summer when I was excavating with Nathaniel Kitchell at Blackman Stream. And that's a really deeply stratified site off the Penobscot River, close to Maine. And what we saw was that about 2.3 meters down, there was a late Paleo component. And then you have an entire meter of sterile alluvial sediments. And above that, so you go 1 meter up, and then you get into kind of the early Middle Archaic assemblages. And they don't look anything like the late Paleo stuff where you have the finely flaked parallel lancelet-shaped points. You don't see those anymore. You have kind of core technology, flakes, big, massive choppers on rough materials. So there's some kind of change there. And Nathaniel was basically trying to figure out the radiocarbon dates that go with the late Paleo-Indian period to see if there is kind of that hiatus in there. But there's a big technological change, and it's not really well understood yet.
Yeah. And so that's why people had a hard time sort of identifying it for a long time, right? Is that you go from these really hyper-diagnostic points and other parts of the Paleo toolkit into this stuff that's kind of uncharismatic, frankly.
Yeah, the quartz core stuff is really
clunky. Like, I mean, this stuff to an untrained eye looks like broken, like crappy rocks.
Shattered quartz.
Yeah. And so it's like fragmented quartz. It's hard even for people who are used to lithics to identify like flaking patterns and that kind of thing. And so you have like some technological change, but you had said, so we brought up maritime archaic, and you were saying how you kind of think more in the early, middle, late archaic.
Yeah.
And so what would be like, what is the big difference between thinking about maritime archaic versus early, middle, and late? And this is kind of for everybody, sort of as contextualized.
So
I don't like maritime archaic because I think it gets rid of a lot of the nuance that you see. So maritime archaic suggests that there is this focus that's entirely kind of maritime. People are utilizing the coast, and that you have this broad culture ranging from northern Labrador down to New Hampshire, say, and that it's pretty much one big culture. And I see so much nuance in the archaeological record that I think the term maritime archaic kind of hides all of that. It puts it in one big pot, and it's hard to describe changes that you see temporally and regionally.
Yeah. And we think of it kind of like a geography thing where you've got like the maritime archaic, you've got this coastal adaptation, but then it's kind of contrasted in the early archaic with this Gulf of Maine archaic thing, which is these quartz core, and that stuff is sort of related but different than the maritime. Like, I mean, like this is the thing, is like all of this stuff is overlapping, and like there are other complexes, like you talked about, like was it Morrow Mountain or Morrill Mountain? Morrow Point. And then there's the Atlantic Slope macro tradition, and so there's these like projectile point styles that are coming up along sort of east of the Appalachians, all the way from the southeast up into parts of northern New England. And these are what we would call like Neville Stark points between about 8,000 and 6,000 years ago. And they come into the Maritimes. And so it's really dynamic in the sense that there's like new technologies. So you have like a lot of stemmed points, which you haven't had before. You've got, like you said, like choppers, you've got groundstone tools. But there are broader patterns that we're seeing within this early part of the archaic, and some of which ties in with like Morrow Point is a burial tradition, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Tradition. And you have some early hints at, like, you've got what's the one up in Lansing up in Labrador that is sort of seems to be the earliest version of what comes to be known as the maritime archaic. And so
we're just all going to pause and let Ken just keep riffing about everything. It's one of the greatest.
But like, so if we're trying to give people an overview, after about 6,000 years ago, we have a little bit better idea what's happening.
I think that's true. Could I foreshadow something we're going to talk about here? And this is probably a question both for Dave and Josh. Can you talk to us a little bit about what we don't know about the coast during the Archaic period, and what we've learned from the coast through like scalp drags and things like that? Like, Dave, I know you wrote up an interesting diagnostic artifact from a scalp drag.
One of the things that listeners may not realize is that one of the reasons that there's so much confusion about the Archaic is because even as recently as the early 1990s, when I started teaching at UNB, there were still people who were publishing and about the idea of the Maritimes at least being largely depopulated for several thousand years after the Paleo-Indian period. And that idea still had a lot of traction, and it continued to have traction at least for another decade or so. So a lot of the information, particularly about the earlier parts of the Archaic in the Maritimes, has been accumulated so recently that it's not surprising that there's a lot of controversy about it, and there's very little consensus about how to interpret it and even how to categorize it.
Yeah, and so part of that was that, as we mentioned, it's early Archaic stuff tends to be a little bit uncharismatic, and then at Brigham and Sharrow, it was deeply stratified. And those are two sites in Maine that kind of were like, so you've got these very obvious looking diagnostic points that go until, I don't know, they're certainly dominant in New Hampshire, start to go into Maine. And then by like Bangor, people were like, where's the Archaic? And then in a CRM project, I believe, for a bridge replacement at the Brigham and Sharrow site, they found deeply stratified quartz technology basically with good radiocarbon dates.
Yeah. When Brian Robinson defined the Gulf of Maine Archaic, one of the points that he made was that the reason that the visibility of early and middle Archaic, how, if you want to call it that, in Maine and the Maritimes, was because there were few or no diagnostic projectile points for several thousand years after the Paleo-Indian period. And since everybody in archaeology, at least in the Northeast, is projectile point obsessed, were then still are, it made that particular period very difficult to understand.
Yeah. You didn't have a point to frame everything around, right? So you had to kind of do a whole assemblage analysis to try to understand what the patterns.
And it must be so hard to name a tradition that doesn't have a diagnostic point. Like, that must be frustrating, you know? And the other thing that's going on, though, is sea level rise appears to have nuked, basically, a large part of what would have been a coastal Archaic record.
Yeah, because at that time, the water levels in like the Bay of Fundy, for example, have retreated to somewhere between 20 and 60 meters below their current levels.
60 to 70 meters below modern sea level. So 15,000 years ago, they're 60 or 70 meters above the modern high tide line. By 10 to 9,000 years ago, they're 60 to 70 meters below the modern high tide line, and then they come back up. So people living on the coast after the Paleo-Indian period, their coastal sites are essentially gone until about, arguably 4,000 years
ago or less.
And for the American listener, that's 482 CFL fields.
Yeah.
I think it was Spiess and Shaw in 2024 stated that in the Gulf of Maine, 12,500 years ago was the low stand.
Okay.
So basically, on the Gulf of Maine, up to the late Archaic, so roughly 4,000 years ago, anything between 12,500 and 4,000 is underwater. And in the Bay of Fundy, sea level rise is more aggressive, so that goes to basically 3,000 years ago. So just a huge piece of the archaeological record missing.
And we see that in scallop drags, right? So I think Spiess and Price have just done a scallop drag paper. But Dave, you've also written up a full channel gouge from a scallop drag. And I guess my understanding is the guys running the drags don't know exactly where they pick them up, but they've got kind of a ballpark idea. And if you look at the bathymetry, this sort of lines up.
Yeah, they have a pretty good idea where they find them, I think.
Yeah, I think the modern ones, because subsurface GPS or whatever you want to call it has become much more sophisticated over the last 30 or 40 years. So when people find stuff now, they have a much better idea where they got it from than they did 30 or 40 years ago. Cool.
Yeah. The other thing that we aren't talking about that's super complicated is the transitional or terminal Archaic. The listener can't see, but Dave just left. He's no, we're not doing this. And this is we get very diagnostic points again, and this is maybe like 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, somewhere in there. But we don't really know what's going on, and it's a subject of some debate in the archaeological record. So there's potentially something called Susquehanna, which is technology, an idea, or a population replacement, depending on where you come down. Do either of you guys have thoughts about that before we jump into talking about Rum Beach?
We skipped the late Archaic.
Late Archaic's really interesting, but yeah. But it's not as complicated as the rest of it. True. Yeah. Maybe it is. I don't know.
Okay, Josh.
Okay. I don't think it was a population replacement. I don't know this too well, but it seems to be that early on there was kind of like a scattering of Susquehanna transitional Archaic stuff seen kind of in southwestern New Brunswick, and it was thought of as kind of people starting to migrate into the area, a little bit of initial parties coming into the area. And basically what we know now through our work in the Quaddy region is that there were a lot of transitional Archaic sites
It wasn't just a small group of people coming into the area. It was, there's sites all over the place. It's I think it was people that were still here just changed their lithic tradition, changed the way they make projectile points is what makes the most sense to me.
Cool. And what do those points look like? Just while we're
I'll let Dave take that one.
Well, some of them are broad points in the classic sense of broad points, the way it's used in most of the Northeast. So they're large projectile points. Probably most of them are actually knife blades rather than projectile points. They're very broad at the shoulders. They often have triangular blades, and they're often made on 5-sided biface blanks, and very often made out of either Kenio traveler volcanic materials from Maine or various kinds of banded volcanics.
Can you describe a 5-sided blank? I think the Dungeons and Dragons listener just thought about a way to roll for more mana.
I don't know how I can do it without using my hands. I mean, they're essentially right. They're essentially so they've got a point at the end, obviously, because at the distal end they have two blade margins that come down to shoulders. The shoulders are indented towards the stem, and then the stem projects below that.
Great.
Some of them have square stems, some of the earlier ones. Some of the later ones have more like expanding or notched stems. And one of the things that I remember from at least from the ones in New England is that sometimes the stems were made by punching the notches rather than flaking them.
Okay, interesting. Right.
And they're made from preforms, not flakes.
Yeah, that's right. They're made from preforms, not flakes, which is a big difference from some of the earlier material.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yeah.
And as Ken mentioned, we did not talk about the late Archaic. Ken, you got some experience with the late Archaic?
Do I?
Well, we were talking about it earlier.
Oh. Yeah, so around 5,500 years ago, we sort of enter into the late Archaic. And so...
Or what Josh might call the middle Archaic.
Yeah. But probably between about 5,500 and 4,000 years ago, late maritime Archaic is probably most closely associated with what we would call the Moorehead phase or Moorehead burial tradition. But what else is going on around that time,
Josh?
Well, this is just another reason that I don't use maritime Archaic. It's because 6,000 to maybe 4,500, 4,300, you have what's called the Laurentian tradition. And that's it gets really complicated in their Laurentian tradition because what we see is these large, thick bifaces with wide side notches at the base come into the toolkit, and they're termed Otter Creek points. So these come into the toolkit around 6,000 years ago. They show up at Sharrow and Brigham. I think they're dated to roughly 5,800.
There's two sites in the Quaddy region, close to the Quaddy region, interior, 9520 that Steve Cox excavated that has a lot of Otter Creek points, and then Medibemps. And so the thinking on this is that you have a middle Archaic toolkit, right? You have unifacial technology of core technology, fully channeled gouges in some cases, groundstone rods, and then you have the addition of the Otter Creek point. So it's probably middle Archaic peoples bringing in this Otter Creek style tool into their toolkit. So you have that up until 4,500, 4,300, and then you get the switch to the Moorehead phase, which uses a totally different toolkit altogether. You have a stemmed point, they're thick, and they are very sharp.
I don't know where I was going with this.
Well, they're made on flake blanks.
Yeah, made on...
One of the things that distinguishes them from terminal Archaic technology.
Yeah.
These are these platform retained curved small stem points that you're finding in all these late maritime Archaic sites or late Archaic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the listener may not know this, but Josh actually maintains a website called Otterknot, where you can send in pictures to find out if it's an Otter Creek point or not.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things we should point out is just how unusual those late Archaic projectile points are. I mean, there is no other time period in the Northeast and I don't know of anywhere else either, where people intentionally retained the striking platforms of flake blanks on the bases of their projectile points. And one of the things that one would want to ask oneself is, why did they do that? And we don't have a clue.
Yeah.
As far as I know.
And like the other questions too, like why add Otter Creek bifaces to this existing toolkit, right? Like what is the advantage that the Otter Creek biface, or, is it a group of people coming in and interacting? Is it just this idea that, you've got a new type of spear technology or something like that? Or is it something completely different? We don't have answers for those things, but do you have any thoughts about it?
Not particularly. I was talking to Bonnie Newsom a few weeks ago when I was on a research trip to Maine, and she had mentioned to me that she thought they might be used for big game like moose. She didn't know, but maybe when moose were introduced to the region, if you needed a big tool for butchering, a big animal, it makes a lot of sense to me, but I'm not sure. That's just something that she mentioned. Something else that I want to mention too is that the Otter Creek points and kind of the Laurentian tradition has it hasn't always, but it's been thought of as kind of an interior focused tradition. A lot of Otter Creek points are found on lake margins, along rivers, at outlets, things like that. So for a long time, it was believed that the Laurentian period Otter Creek using peoples were focused on the interior, while the Moorehead phase in that late Archaic portion was focused on the coast. And our research has kind of shown that that's probably not the case, because we've encountered several Otter Creek points on the coast, and also several other semi-diagnostic artifacts of the Laurentian tradition, such as, fully channeled
People coming in and interacting. Is it just this idea that, you've got a new type of spear technology or something like that? Or is it something completely different? We don't have answers for those things, but do you have any thoughts about it?
Not particularly. I was talking to Bonnie Newsom a few weeks ago when I was on a research trip to Maine, and she had mentioned to me that she thought they might be used for big game like moose. She didn't know, but maybe when moose were introduced to the region, if you needed a big tool for butchering, a big animal, it makes a lot of sense to me, but I'm not sure. That's just something that she mentioned. Something else that I want to mention too is that the Otter Creek points and kind of the Laurentian tradition has it hasn't always, but it's been thought of as kind of an interior focused tradition. A lot of Otter Creek points are found on lake margins, along rivers, at outlets, things like that. So for a long time, it was believed that the Laurentian period Otter Creek using peoples were focused on the interior, while the Moorehead phase in that late Archaic portion was focused on the coast. And our research has kind of shown that that's probably not the case, because we've encountered several Otter Creek points on the coast, and also several other semi-diagnostic artifacts of the Laurentian tradition, such as, fully channeled gouges, groove cobbles, that could be placed in the Laurentian tradition, are coming up in scallop drags. So we have a pretty good idea now that the Laurentian tradition was coastal, and it was not just a interior tradition. And also at the 9520, Steve Cox.
That's a site in Maine. Just a site number. Yeah.
95 point.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just interior American side of the Quaddy region. He excavated swordfish rostrum that was barbed, probably a harpoon, and it had a radiocarbon date associated with it of 5,000 BP, which falls right into that Laurentian tradition. So there's a good chance they're probably hunting swordfish, utilizing the coast. Also at Medimemps, I think they found something like 15 different fragments of swordfish rostrum. I'm not sure what the dates on that were, whether they were Moorehead phase or Laurentian, but interesting to see.
So I'm always fond of this because when I was an undergraduate at the University of Maine, Brian Robinson had, for some reason, some back dirt from the Nevin site. And we were screening it for a lab class. And there was this big, huge hunk of bone, no idea what it was. And somewhat chagrined, I asked Brian, I was like, this looks really weird. I don't know what it is. He's like, oh, that's swordfish. And I was like, oh, all right, cool.
Yeah. So we think of like late maritime archaic as kind of like classic sword fishing culture. So is it basically like, is it possible that these are very related groups? We just haven't been able to stitch this stuff together, and that it's just kind of depending upon geography, or is it like a habitation versus cemetery thing going on, or do they really seem like completely separate ideas, like Laurentian versus Moorehead?
That's a good question. I don't want to get myself into. So this is where the red ochre tradition kind of comes in. And I think this is where the maritime archaic idea kind of really came from, is you have this red ochre ceremonialism that goes back 8,500 years and is fairly continuous. Yeah. And then you've got your sites in Maine, Morro Point.
There's an off Scott Bay that I can never remember the name of.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Oh, Turner Farm. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, sorry.
I used to red ochre.
Is there not? No? Oh, okay.
No, that's a Susquehanna.
That's a confusing site because of that, yes.
So you have this long red ochre ceremonial tradition that is very clearly expansive, covers the Northeast. And that is pretty much continuous up until the transitional archaic, roughly 3,700 years ago. And then it abruptly disappears. So there's probably a related ceremonial complex. There's something going on that's continuing through time. As far as subsistence and settlement patterns and traditions, I don't know.
So we have you guys on here to talk about one site in particular that you're writing about, but basically part of the reason we wanted to do this recap was sort of to position everybody to kind of get the sense that, like, although we are uncovering more about the archaic, we actually know very little about it. But what we learned, I would say probably in the last like 18 to 24 months, is almost entirely coming from looking at collections and kind of piecing this back together, which I think kind of ties in with the whole idea with what was going on at the Rum Beach site in the Quoddy region, right? So like it's using these collections to stitch together time periods that we have a really kind of poor understanding of. And so can you talk a little bit about the importance of the collections that you've been looking at and how you guys are piecing through this?
And that's actually great, Ken. Now that we've learned a little about the archaic, I can finish writing the rest of the questions while they answer that one.
Well, why don't I start by saying a few words about how the whole Rum Beach monograph came together? So I really started writing that monograph just after I retired from teaching at UNB. And the reason was because I was looking at a map one day, and I've always got all my best ideas from looking at maps, I have to say. I was looking at a map one day, and it occurred to me that there was some similarity between the Rum Beach site and some other sites where collectors had showed me what I was pretty much convinced were terminal archaic artifacts. And when I compared those site locations to the locations of woodland period shell-bearing sites, for example, and even historic homestead sites and stuff like that, what I saw was that they were dramatically different in terms of where they were located. Woodland period sites and often historic sites, which are often closely associated with woodland period sites, are often usually are exposed towards the south and sheltered towards the northwest. That's sheltered against prevailing winter winds and exposed to sunshine and good weather in the summertime. The archaic sites were completely different from that. First of all, they were on low gradient shorelines, and the low gradient shorelines were almost always exposed to the west or the northwest, sometimes to the northeast, sometimes both the northeast and the northwest. And so I wrote the monograph for two reasons. One was because I was frustrated because nobody had ever thoroughly and completely described one of these intertidal assemblages from a single site. People talk about them in the literature, but they'd never really describe them. So, and I actually got very obsessive compulsive about it. And anybody who looks at the monograph will see the OCD all the way through it. Okay.
The edition now.
Yes, that's right. We are never going to touch it again. Let's just see it out.
Well, you did a great job, and I helped at the tail end.
You did a great job at the end. So, and we'll come to that later because there's an interesting story about that. So that was the first reason, was because I wanted to do an exhaustive description and analysis of a single intertidal component like that. The second reason was because I wanted to put forward this argument that the Archaic was different from the woodland in the Quaddy region. And I've convinced myself of that. And I'm hoping when people look at the monograph that they'll be convinced of it too.
Yeah, I think it really will. But I should say there was a sort of preceding CJA article as well that advanced some of the general points of the argument as well, right?
Yeah, I try to, not direct people to that anymore because I'm, ashamed of about 50% of it now.
Oh, I thought it's a great
article. Yeah,
it's I would not use the term Susquehanna tradition anymore.
Okay,
because I'm not convinced it's meaningful enough in this part of the world. I think David Sanger he criticized me for that at the time, and I think he was probably right about that. Okay.
But still useful for an idea of kind of regional integration, I think.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think of the time, that was sort of the go-to phrase.
Yeah. So that, I guess if there was a third reason for doing the monograph, it was to supersede that 2000 article.
Okay. We'll put it with the first episode of this podcast.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
No, yes. And so do you want to tell us a little bit about the story, just about, you mentioned you working with collectors. How did you end up at Rum Beach?
Okay.
Also, why is it called Rum Beach? That's kind of a fun story.
Boy.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a long digression. So how all of the Archaic research I've done, the Quaddy region stuff, and also the stuff I did up at St. Croix, has been done because of artifacts that were showed to me by collectors. That's the first thing. So I knew some collectors on Deer Island. They showed me an artifact. They told me, we've got an artifact we found on the Bliss Islands. You're going to want to see that. I figured it would be a projectile point that they found adjacent to one of the sites that we'd already tested. It turns out it's this great big retouched flake of dark colored volcanic, completely different from anything we ever found in a shell bearing site. And they pointed to the map and they said, we found it here. And I said, no way. It would never have occurred to me. I'd been on that beach before, but it never occurred to me to look for flake stone tools or anything like that there. So the next time I was out on the islands, I was there with some students. We went out, we looked. We weren't there for 5 minutes before one of the students found another flake stone tool on that beach. And now we've got something like 150 or 160, maybe 170 pieces of flaked and groundstone off that site now. Much of it, I think, probably from the Terminal Archaic and the Terminal Archaic early woodland transition, so roughly between 3,700 and 2,700 years ago. But there are a few artifacts, including a grooved cobble, that are clearly earlier than that, maybe back as far as what Josh would refer to as Middle Archaic.
Cool. Yeah. Excellent. And then why is it called Rum Beach?
It's called Rum Beach because a schooner full of illegal booze was wrecked on that beach in the 1920s. There's a whole long story behind that. It's in the monograph. I won't go through it here, but
and we'll link the monograph in the show notes. It's available online through the UNB Scholar Work, sort of what it's called.
The Scholar Research Story, yeah.
Nice.
So and the beach, I have to say, is still littered with broken liquor bottles. Okay.
And that was even before your field school. Got that? Yeah.
Oh, nice. Yes.
So you mentioned the unique aspects of the site in that the transitional archaic sites seem to be like they're sited differently, like they're located in different places than you'd expect woodland sites to be at. And there's this, so what's unique about the site and what's unique about this dark volcanic flaked stone tool that kind of piqued your interest?
Well, first of all, the Rum Beach site, and I think some of the other sites that we talk about in the monograph, are actually eroding out from underneath buried land surfaces, and those land surfaces are now buried underneath salt marshes. I think when they were occupied by archaic people, they were actually they were well above the high water line, at least by a meter or two, probably meter anyway. And they were probably meadows and with freshwater marshes adjacent to them or something like that. And as the sea levels risen since the Archaic, slowly they've been inundated and saturated, and then salt marshes have built up on top of them. So now there's almost a meter of salt marsh peat above the layer where I think the artifacts are coming from at the Rum Beach site.
Which would pose a challenge to excavate.
Yeah, I was going to say, has anybody tested or done coring on these to?
Dina Incas and her students excavated an intertidal site, which I think in some ways is probably similar to Rum Beach, at the Atlantic Ledges in Massachusetts, way back in the I think it might have been the 1970s. But the sea level and tidal ranges are quite different in Massachusetts. And so what was possible there, I think, would be impossible now. Chris Turnbull once suggested that we try digging in the marsh to see if we could find a preserved boat. I thought that was a great idea, but I did think it was a very good use of our time.
That is a great idea.
That is a great idea. Yeah. Get a nice dugout canoe, just plonked right in the middle.
Oh, right. It's too early for Norse.
With a swordfish in it.
Yeah, exactly. And so you mentioned though that you're thinking about Rum Beach just in terms of Susquehanna, transitional Archaic has sort of evolved a little bit, and you go into that in the manuscript. But could you maybe give kind of the Cliff Notes version of how your thinking's evolved on that?
Yeah. So there are some bifaces and projectile points that are reminiscent of terminal Archaic material further south and west. But there are also some things that are distinctive. And one of the things is that there are these large flakes that appear to be either use-worn or deliberately retouched around the edges. There's also cortical spall tools, which I've never seen in any other time period in the Maritimes. And if you guys know of instances of those kind of tools from interior sites, I'd love to know about them.
And what is a cortical spall then?
Well, you take a cobble that's been beach rolled, a nice cobble of material that's flakeable. You whack it hard enough to knock a big flake off the outside of it, so it's got a ventral surface, flake surface on the inside, but on the outside it's still got the cortex from the original cobble. And then you either just use it the way it is, or you retouch the edge a little bit to make it the way you want it to be, and then you use it. For what? I have no idea.
Maybe you don't need a haft.
I think they probably were hand tools, but they're mysterious because they're just so on.
Yeah, the listener may have gathered that the Archaic is hard, which is why Ken and I let people deal with it.
It is hard. Do you find other stuff there, like the kind of classic, Susquehanna, like those diamond cross-section drills and that kind of thing? Like those are really classic Susquehanna tools that are ones that you would expect to see that you don't see before that time period, right?
Drill bits with terminal
Archaic style bases on them, so they were retouched from projectile points.
And
ground celts and axes too.
Right?
Yeah. It's like there are no groove axes from Rum Beach, but there is a flaked and ground axe, which may in fact be early woodland.
Okay.
It's not impossible. There's also Orient fishtail projectile points, two of them from Rum Beach, both of them, I think, made out of Kineo Traveler Mountain porphyries from Maine, So there are those kind of diagnostics.
Do you have any the rare stuff like the turkey tails or anything like that?
Nothing like that. The other thing that's unusual is that there are these flake tools that are about halfway between a flake tool and a deliberately made blade tool. Okay. And again, there's something that I haven't seen. I think David Sanger found some comparable ones in some coastal sites in Maine, maybe even on the what's the group of islands you're working on down there, Gabe? The Roke, I think on one of the Roke Island sites at the base of it. But again, as far as I know, nobody's ever reported that technology from an interior site in the Maritimes.
That's interesting.
What about the blade-like stuff from Dead Man's Pool?
Like, is that
the same kind of technology?
I've looked at that stuff, so I don't know. And it would be that's a very interesting idea because
It's shield archaic.
Yeah. So I mean, I looked at that stuff, and none of the cores line up with it's unclear what they're making these blades off of, because all the cores that, or at least the ones that he collected that are in the collection, are like flake cores that, and like a more like a multi-directional or bifacial cores, and probably geared toward making all of these lanceolate early woodland bifaces and like meadowood style bifaces that are there. But then you've got all these blade-like flakes, some of which are prismatic, and some of which just look like blade-like flakes, and it's unclear what they're being detached.
Well, that's fascinating, and I should look at that stuff sometime. And one of the reasons I think it's fascinating is because the Tobic River Basin has always been known as a place where there's a lot of evidence for early woodland material. And David Sanger even argued one time that the ways in which the sort of terminal archaic, broadly speaking, stuff in southwestern New Brunswick was different from the classic stuff further south was because it was more like some of the stuff that he'd seen in northern New Brunswick when he worked in the Tobic and the upper and the middle St. John.
Okay.
So there probably is a connection there, and it'd be a really interesting one to pursue.
Yeah, I really would.
Totally.
Something to put a graduate student.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I've got two sites that I've looked at that I couldn't really figure out what was going on there, and so might be something you and I have to sit down and look at some photographs. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Also, does anyone notice the flip starts to taste a little bit like a chai latte, like lukewarm?
Mine's getting a little bit more eggy.
Yeah,
as we get down.
So a lot of this work. Oh, go ahead.
I said gross.
Oh, gross. Yes. So a lot of the work you guys have been doing involves responsible educational archaeologists. You mentioned this in the monograph, and I know just from talking about you're very engaged with this. Can you describe that process a little bit and just why you think it's important for professional archaeologists to work with responsible educationals?
You can start this one. I'll go off.
Actually, I'm going to go on a tangent instead first, and I'm gonna, because I need to finish the story about the monograph. So what happened with the monograph is the first version of it I had posted on the Scholar Research Repository at UNB in 2018, and then over the next few years, collectors in the Quoddy region kept showing me stuff from more sites and more sites and more sites that was similar to the stuff from Rum Beach and the stuff that I already put into the monograph. And so I decided I was going to do a second version of it, and I was going to include a bunch of artifacts that in an appendix that have been showed to me since the 2018 version. And I put that up in 2023 on the Scholar Repository. Well, I don't think the electrons had even stopped agitating from the posted that monograph when Josh got in touch with me and said, Dave, some of the projectile points that you say are terminal archaic are in fact late archaic in age. And so he spent the next year or so convincing me that I was wrong about a bunch of them. And he was right about them.
I wouldn't say that. It might have been two.
Huh? Well, there was more than two. But it's true. I was not sufficiently cognizant of the fact that it wouldn't just be terminal archaic. I should have known this too, because we'd already found the groove cobble. I should have known that there was a possibility of earlier stuff being there.
And that's interesting in and of itself, right? To have Susquehanna kind of in place overlapping with late archaic,
because we don't think of them as the same people, right?
Yeah. Right.
And so it is interesting. And so so Josh and I spent the next 18 months sort of doing some more research, looking at some more collections, and we put yet another appendix, the final appendix on the monograph, showing some
Josh has a lot of guys, and Dave said final appendix, but Dave is
a series of artifacts that we are convinced they're all from intertidal assemblages in the Quoddy region, many of them from the same sites as the terminal archaic artifacts, and we are convinced that they are terminal archaic. Are late archaic in age. And when we say late archaic, we mean consistent with the Moorehead phase material from Maine. So Moorehead burial tradition.
So, but that's a little bit more like Turner Farm, though, isn't it? Like where you've got late, like Moorehead phase stuff with the Susquehanna component over top of it, isn't? Isn't that and that's what made Turner Farm so unique, was that you had the two, what everybody always thought were like two different populations kind of occupying the same.
It's not just Turner Farm though, because I mean one of the issues about the Archaic has always been that so much of what we know about it has been based on mortuary ceremonial sites rather than habitation sites. But one of the things that we know consistently about mortuary ceremonial sites is that even the ones that are mostly Moorehead phase or late Archaic in age often have terminal Archaic mortuary features on them as well. The one in St. John does. Many other point. Yeah, and there are a whole series of those.
One of the biggest ones in the Quaddy region is probably Casco Bay Islands, and
Yes.
that has a huge amount of transitional Archaic period artifacts and a massive amount of Moorehead phase artifacts as well in collections.
Including a hexagonal bayonet,
Right.
which did you tell me there's only one other place in the Northeast where those are on a site on an island?
Yes, there might be two. Monhegan Island has bayonet fragments, and I think the Basin site, but there's not many. It's okay. So bayonet is part of the late Moorehead phase or late Moorehead burial tradition. So probably you'd be looking 4100 to 3800 BP. They are very, very delicate slate hexagonal bayonets, just like the name suggests. So they're six-sided, and they're very thin, and they come to a very sharp point. Oftentimes they can be decorated with hash marks, various decorations. What would you say about the bases, Dave?
The taper, the bases as well as the blades on them taper to a point off.
Sometimes they have shoulders.
Sometimes they have shoulders. Sometimes they have notched shoulders.
Yeah.
And they're reminiscent of swordfish
Right.
rostra.
Exactly.
Because some of them are kind of like have serrations, like pointed serrations on them that look a little bit like a rostrum. Eh?
There are a number of different kinds of design elements that have been found on them.
And not just that, but there are also swordfish rostrums that have been turned into hexagonal bayonets.
Right.
So
how related are these to those like big hexagonal like harpoon heads? Like the ones that you were showing me earlier, like the one that was found in Scallop Dragger, the great big thick guy.
Well, those are not hexagonal. They might be related through, just slate technology being passed down through time, or the continued use of slate. But
No, like technological or
other than the use of ground slate, no.
Okay.
And do we know where the slate's from? Do we still think it's from Monson, Maine? What are we thinking?
I don't think anybody knows has ever been able to trace the origins. I
Okay.
talk about Monson because that's a series of slate quarries. In fact, I think they still quarry slate.
Yeah, I had an apartment with a sink from the Monson Slate Quarry, which I was sorely tempted to steal when we moved out.
So Bruce Bork at the Maine State Museum told me that he believed that most of the bayonets were quarried from Monson. He had mentioned that there had been bayonets and bayonet fragments found in the streams around Monson, which he used to suggest that it was probably a quarry of some sort.
One of the things we should say about bayonets is that there's pretty compelling evidence that those bayonets were never intended to be stuck into live animals during a hunt, that those were in fact all or mostly all manufactured as artifacts to be put into mortuary ceremonial contexts, red ochre burials essentially. In fact, and one of the best pieces of evidence for that is that many of the bayonets from the Cow Point site in New Brunswick are decorated only on one side. Yet we're clearly intended to be placed in burials with the decorated side up.
It's interesting point. Yeah. So, just on
Steering away a little bit from the late Archaic stuff, but you brought up an interesting question about sourcing. And one of the things that happens in the transitional Archaic is you have this, you mentioned in the early Archaic, there's this adoption of like banded materials and darker materials to shift away from fine grain stuff. Dave, you've talked a little bit about like the transitional Archaic being this period of time when you're starting to see kind of the reintroduction of finer grain materials and these kind of transitional materials. And so where
materials can mean rocks.
Yeah. So where are like, you talked about Kineo in Maine as being kind of a key source. Where are people going for rocks to make their stone tools, and how does that change from earlier in the Archaic?
Yeah. We maybe should a little bit of big picture background again. Okay. So in the Paleo-Indian period, when people were first occupied and inhabited the Maine Maritimes area, the flake stone tools tended to be made out of very high, what we would call high quality silica materials. They're actually quite attractive. Many of them are semi-precious gemstone quality cherts and agates and chalcedonies and things like that. In the late woodland period, and to some extent in the middle woodland period, and a little bit back into the early woodland period, those kind of materials also are used for ceremonial objects, but also for utilitarian objects. Some of them from the same sources as were used in Paleo-Indian times, some of them from different sources. So that's the two ends of the continuum of culture history, of indigenous culture history before European contact. Okay. In the middle of that is the 7,000 years of the Archaic, when, as another archaeologist once said to me, people essentially lived cheek by jowl with the sources of those fine-grained chalcedonies and agates, and walked right past them every day and never used them. Instead, they used what we would call these sort of intractable materials like felsic volcanics, quartzites, bull quartz, and these kinds of materials to make almost all of their flake stone tools. And to me, that's a puzzle. It's, as somebody who's been interested in flake stone technology all through his career, that puzzles me. And I have no answer to the question of why that should be so.
Yeah, some of it is maybe like a technological limitation. Like, like you and I both worked around washed oak chert. It'd be very hard to make a very big biface out of washed oak chert.
Why would you want a big biface?
Yeah, that I was going to say that begs the question. What?
Yeah, but some of these massive materials are better for these bigger, clunkier broad points and that kind of thing, right? Or you like maybe I don't know, maybe not.
Yeah, possibly so, but it still begs the question of
why were they ignored?
Yeah.
Because
I mean, all those things. Like I remember when I left Bates, I had a couple of big chunks of Kineo rhyolite. And Jesse Webb and I wanted to break them up, which we did by throwing it off his second floor apartment porch into his driveway. Yeah.
It might be worth mentioning too, Dave, that a lot of the stuff that we've seen may have come from quarries.
Yes, that is the other difference. It's not a complete difference, but it does seem like during the Archaic, people tended to want to use materials that came from quarry sources rather than from cobbles and secondary sources and things.
Yeah, interesting.
But that's not an absolute difference by any.
Yeah.
Because arguably, a place like Washington Oak, for example, that's a quarry source.
And Munsangan and and like a Minas Basin, like those places you would expect. But yeah. I mean, like the whole idea that people eschew this kind of these fine grain, pretty materials for what tend to be darker, coarser, banded stuff. And I always liked your argument that Tobic rhyolite, which you see a ton of in the transitional Archaic and early woodland, is like a midpoint where people are sort of picking a more massive material, but has a lot of red in it and actually has like cherty blebs throughout it. So it's like, you're sort of softly you're kind of doing a soft launch of Jaspers again, right?
Yeah.
I think that may be true. It is in fact not the case that you see Tobic rhyolite during the terminal Archaic. I've never seen, not in the Quaddy region anyway, I've never seen a convincing artifact made out of Tobic rhyolite. But there are convincing early woodland artifacts made out of that material.
Jerry's place that we saw a couple of years ago. That great
Is that
big,
made out of Tobic?
yeah.
Okay. There's that fish tank.
Alleged Tobic.
Okay, but that would be early woodland. What I'm saying is that there is not a convincing terminal archaic artifacts. I think the early woodland may be where you see materials like the Tobic rhyolite being used as a sort of an entry level into the kind of materials that people are going to want to use later on.
The gateway chert.
The gateway chert. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Speaking about quarries, do you guys have opinions on archaic period watercraft? Thoughts about this? You might not. I don't know. I'm just curious.
Bill, Josh.
Oh, okay.
They're in the peat.
Yeah.
I don't know how to get into this without. Can I just jump into something?
Yeah.
I'm just going to start somewhere.
Bring your paddle.
So as you know, Gabe, I did my thesis on Falls Island, and we expected that. There's a big legacy collection from Falls Island that is roughly 100 years old, collected by the Knapton brothers. They
Collected 100 years old. This material's older than that.
Yes. Sorry, the collection was collected 100 years ago by the Knapton brothers. They were a unique pair of brothers from the American side of the Quad region. One used to walk around with a pigeon on his head, apparently. Anyways,
It was style of time.
no, he sounds like a real interesting guy. But so we expected to find a lot of woodland period artifacts, and what we found was a lot of late archaic, and that was really interesting. And I jumped right into the late archaic, and so Falls Island, there was 4 sites on the island. 2 of them kind of conformed to what would be typical of, Dave described the woodland period sites, kind of southwest facing, not really facing the open water, close to clam flats. And then there was a really interesting northeastern site that faced the open water. It had a low relief beach, gravel beach, real shallow. And it was kind of unlike any woodland period sites. And a lot of the late archaic artifacts could be placed there. So there was a lot of groundstone tools, big pecten ground adzes. There was a projectile point that was diagnostic of the late archaic. There was a foreshaft, a bone foreshaft. So that's a specialized tool used for open water hunting. That basically a bone harpoon slots into the foreshaft, and when you stick an animal, the foreshaft comes loose, the bone harpoon stays in, and you're just along for the Nantucket sleigh ride at that point. And there was also barbed harpoons, so all kinds of late archaic artifacts. And so, anyway, long story short, what I said with my thesis was that during the late archaic, this site probably functioned as an open water hunting station. So it's probably an area where they're going out, they're hunting swordfish, they're fishing cod, they have direct access out to those open waters where that would be possible. And also the big groundstone tools that you see, the big adzes, gouges, things like that, they're perfect for making big dugout canoes that you probably want to utilize if you're out hunting a swordfish. It would be really scary to hunt a swordfish in a birch bark canoe.
Nothing ruins your day like a swordfish appearing in your canoe from the bottom.
Yeah.
So we don't have evidence of dugout canoes, but the tool forms, the big groundstone, pecten ground tool forms were probably utilized for making big dugout canoes. And also the low relief beach would be perfect for landing and launching these big dugout canoes because they would be heavy.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my hypothesis was that they're using big dugout canoes during this.
Yeah, and for the listener, these, like, the way we envision these dugout canoes, there's some sort of pretty good ethnographic information about different groups around the world that have made dugout canoes. And it's the idea is you take a big tree, you kind of, like, in a lot of cases, like in Polynesia, for example, you light a fire on one side of the tree and you kind of burn out part of it, and then you chip out all the burnt wood to hollow it out. But you need these big heavy tools to kind of scrape out the insides of this, what is essentially a felled tree.
Not just in Polynesia, because Champlain saw people doing that in southern New England.
Oh, really?
When he
Okay,
sailed
interesting.
Down there, and he
a great woodcut of it.
And he described them as using tools like French gunflints to carve out the burned wood out of the center of the canoe they were building.
Interesting.
Well, what do those tools sound like?
Yeah.
They sound like those little woodland scrapers made out of exotic cherts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. Actually. Yeah.
Maybe that's what
And,
that thing is from.
That might be what that's out there. Yeah.
If I can just continue for a second, so kind of getting into the late archaic work that me and Dave have done with the avocationals, these settlement and subsistence patterns that we kind of first saw at Falls Island with these low relief beaches, kind of facing the open water, that continued when we looked at avocational collections in the Quaddy region. So you have a very typical site for the maritime archaic, I'll use it, or the late archaic, would be facing the open water. You have that low relief beach, and you've got yourself a good late archaic site. So they're using it plausibly for this open water hunting, cod fishing, sword fishing. It seems to be a pattern that we see in the Quaddy region. So, it's at Casco Bay Island, Indian Island, Deer Island Point kind of is oriented towards the open water.
And those low relief beaches would be a place where you could, at high tide, you could ground your big dugout canoe, and then it could just sit there when the tide went down. As long as you anchored it somehow, it wouldn't float away on you when the tide came back up again.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's a difference between then and the woodland period, when at some point people adopted or invented birch bark canoes, and then they didn't need to have that. They could live in a different kind of, or adjacent to a different kind of landform, because they could simply pick their canoes up and carry them up and put them beside their houses.
Yeah.
They didn't have to have them anchored on the shore.
It's not like that chestnut we used to do survey. But
I was going to say that would have been nice to have the gradual beach. We did not have that.
And I just want to riff on something since you kind of mentioned that. So the listener might be saying, well, there are no swordfish in the Bay of Fundy or really the Gulf of Maine right now. And that's true. But 4,000 years ago and back, the water temperatures were much different, and the Bay of Fundy was a much different place than it is now. So roughly 4,000, 5,000, maybe even back farther, the tidal amplitude was much, much lower than it is now. So you didn't have that sloshing effect of fresh water coming in and coming out, and all the upwelling, cooling down the water. So what swordfish need, or what they like, is high, warm sea surface temperatures. So when the sea surface temperatures are warm, they'll come up and they'll bask in that top layer, and they'll leave kind of a wake behind them, and they'll be swimming real slow. So people with dugout canoes would conceivably come up behind them, harpoon them, and you've got yourself a swordfish.
I'm sure it was just that easy.
Yeah, well,
having read Old Man in the Sea, I know. Yes.
Looking at the amount of swordfish they catch, they got pretty good at it.
Yeah.
So around, I forget what the exact date is, 3,500 years ago or something, there's a Till Dam, I believe, at Minas Basin.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Tidal breach.
I don't know who to.
Shaw, I think, wrote that.
John
Yeah.
Shaw, okay.
Yeah.
Oceanographer who did that work.
It basically lines up with a Glooskop story, right?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
And also lines up very interestingly with the transition from late archaic to terminal archaic.
Yes, so that you have that breach, and you have that sloshing effect that's resonating with the moon, and you get that big tidal amplitude coinciding with rising sea levels. And it's right around that time that evidence of swordfish in the Gulf of Maine disappears. Mm-hmm. We just don't see it anymore.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But
And how does that line up with like the late archaic red ochre stuff disappearing? in terms of time.
Right around the same time period.
Around the same time.
Yeah.
Before we leave swordfish hunting, I should say that right up until the 1950s, people were swordfish hunting out of Yarmouth, out onto Brown's Bank. And David Sanger did a very interesting piece of ethnoarchaeology where he interviewed swordfish hunters and used the information he got from them as a way of interpreting the archaic archaeological record. And you guys might want to put that article into your show notes.
And that's in Painting with a Broad Brush, the J.B. Wright.
I believe that's the one, yes.
There's an J.B. Wright. I think there's a little bit about it in the main bulletin, I think. And we'll slip that into show notes.
I think they still swordfish out in Nova Scotia.
Do they? Yeah.
Is it? Yeah, because they saw a rostrum, right? Is that?
I have a rostrum.
Yeah, I was going to say, I thought you acquired a rostrum from.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Most of Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
So we're going to pivot here in a minute to just some of the stuff you've been doing with Bailey Collection and all that. But I thought we could loop back quickly just on avocationals. Why we need them, why they're so important to this work.
Okay. So here's something that avocational archaeologists have taught me. And that is that archaeologists, when they do coastal surveys, look on coastlines at exactly the wrong time. Okay? Okay. Because it's all, to some extent, it's always tied to the academic calendar. Mm-hmm. So the time that you have free to take students out and go do coastal surveys and stuff like that is going to be in warm weather. It's going to be in the middle of the summer. That's the worst possible time. The best time to go and look for artifacts is early in the spring, when the vegetation's still low on the shorelines and right after the major winter storms.
Yes. Ideally,
that's when the stuff is disturbed. That's when the stuff's disturbed and it's thrown up onto the shorelines.
Yeah. A couple of the avocationals that we both know described to me one time, we were coming out to Indian Island and they hadn't been out since the season before. And it was just like we came around the corner and like, oh, something's changed. And they could tell, just having been out the previous fall, this was like probably early May that we were out there. And the beach had flipped over, basically, right? And like had been totally realigned. We pulled the boat up on the shore, and the first rock that one of them picked up was a grooved cobble. And so, and like they knew where to look. And you're looking at like, the high water mark, the strand lines where the storm beaches come up, and
well, I think that's just someone who like walks their dog on the same beach every day. Yeah, is going to know that way better than someone who comes in for a couple of weeks in the summer.
Yeah.
So collectors are the people who are there with their boats and their boots on, ready to go out and look at stuff when it's likely to be found. And that's one of the most important aspects. What's one of the reasons that collectors should be supported?
Yeah, I agree.
Because they collect stuff that archaeologists are never going to get, never going to see.
And we should say we're talking about collectors too working in erosional contexts.
Exactly.
So these aren't folks that are digging sites. These are folks that are finding things eroded out onto the beach or eroded up out of the intertidal zone.
And are actively reaching out to archaeologists and working and inviting archaeologists into their houses to look at these collections and describe them and
they themselves also have enormous archaeological knowledge. Quite often. They are pretty engaged.
Yeah.
Right. Responsible and responsive collectors.
Yeah. That's the SAA terminology.
Yeah, and we should say at ESAF actually we're hoping to have a increased kind of get back a little bit to that encouraging educational work. There's a committee that's going to be working on that.
And we just saw a recent
Josh is on that committee. That's right.
Yeah, we just saw a recent news posting that the Canadian Archaeological Association has joined with a new group.
Oh, that's right.
Do you remember what the name of it was?
No.
Let me just
go ahead and find it.
Check that.
Well, I asked Josh to tell us what's the latest on the Bailey collection.
I believe we're almost done the catalog.
Yeah, or the collection 410 is the Bailey collection, I guess.
Yeah.
Yes. There's, I think, one tray left of a flake debitage to be cataloged.
Cool.
And then that portion will be done.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Once your work, Ken wants to take it from there. Start writing the culture history. Or...
Yeah, I think there's a few things we're going to be doing. I think listener wouldn't know this, but we had a talking circle in the fall. We also had a ceremony that was led by Ramona Nicholas and Terry Young at the Harriet Irving Library. And so out of those conversations, I think the a lot of interest in bringing the collection and information about the collection to communities in a more fulsome way. So trying to find ways to better communicate about the work that we're doing. Renaming the collection. I believe one of the attendees to the ceremony said that they the word Indian probably shouldn't be on those boxes, and I think the consensus in the room was that was probably very appropriate to remove that from the boxes, and that the collection maybe shouldn't be known as the Bailey collection anymore. And so I think the process of renaming it, there's been conversations around repatriation, but I know that our commitments from the get-go with the resource development consultation coordinators from Wolastoqey Nation included, for example, preparing an ArcGIS story map. So that's probably one of the first things we'll end up doing, is taking some of the scans that we've done, a lot of the artifact photography, and building stories so that we can have something that points people who couldn't necessarily see the collection itself. We can tell some of the stories about the collection and then start moving into things like, preparing a culture history or monograph or, there's a lot of ideas that we can go from there. I think that probably one of the things we're going to have to do is apply for funding again.
Yep.
But yeah. So there's a lot of the getting the inventory done is a big step. So that's really exciting.
And Josh has been doing a lot of that work along with community members, and particularly a lot of the typological side of that.
Yeah,
work.
Yeah. Informing a lot of like what you're doing right now is you're seeing all this stuff in the Bailey collection, and you're seeing, going back to the George Frederick Clark teaching collection at the university at UNB Anthropology, and you're piecing together so this is kind of when I was asking that long, complicated question about collections, was that we don't know a lot about the Archaic, but we're learning a lot more about the late Paleo and the Archaic, looking at these collections and at a broad strokes, seeing where these sites are. And that includes some of the work that you're doing yourself with putting it together, looking at Archaic sites throughout Maine and New Brunswick.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, so including in the George Frederick Clark, you found, so we published a thing in Paleo America fairly recently with some late Paleo points, but you've also found a bunch of other interesting Archaic stuff in there since then, and maybe Paleo too.
So there is a kind of a shocking amount of late Paleo that we've come across in these collections, including the Bailey and the GFC. And I'm working on a paper right now that some of these late Paleo artifacts actually have a provenience to the St. John River, which is very interesting. And also going back and looking at some of the Archaic artifacts. So one of the problems with the early Archaic, that 9,500 to 8,000 years ago is, it's quartz core, it's rods, it's things that are not really diagnostic. So until you have like a radiocarbon date or something like that, it's going to be really difficult to
put these in time,
in the early Archaic.
Yeah.
But once you get to the middle Archaic, points like Neville's and Stark points start to show up. You get into the fully channeled gouges and more diagnostic groundstone artifacts. And then we get into, Laurentian, and there's some Moorehead phase, small stem point stuff going on. And, some of the stuff has provenience, which is great. So we can say, okay, well, there was a site here. And, you can place it, you can put it on a map, and then you can, build meaningful patterns that way.
Yep.
Terrific.
Yeah. And to go back to our note about the CIA, so it was this Canadian Archaeological Association has joined they're a member of the SAA's Council of Allied Societies, which is bringing avocationals and professionals together for collaborative discussion since 1989. And so the CAA is actually taking an active stance, it seems like, in bringing in avocational archaeologists to the fray, which is great.
That's terrific.
Yeah.
Well, that might be a great note to leave it on. We really appreciate chatting with you guys about the Archaic. I don't know if you have any final thoughts about the Archaic, or if we should leave it here.
Do the rods have any, or is there any indication that rod would have been used to make a flip back in the Archaic?
No. That's what the firecraft rocks are for. Yeah. No, nothing that's not really complicated.
All right. Well, you heard it here first. The Archaic's really complicated, listener.
Yep.
And Josh, Dave, thank you very much for coming on the program to share your knowledge about the Archaic with the listener.
Yeah, thanks guys.
Thanks for asking. Thank you.
Yeah,
A lot of fun. Thanks.